So we saw the process of reducing inflation expectations, and we saw that it might lead to a certain cost in terms of reduced gross domestic product, reduced amount of output, reduced amount of jobs for a certain amount of time. So now we're going to look at the two big theories that help us understand what are we giving up and why may we give it up or not. Okay, so try to discuss this recovery speed idea. So the first idea here is that lowering inflation expectations will lead to a certain sacrifice, the sacrifice ratio. So to reduce inflation, we need to reduce monetary policy, so contractionary in the sense that we have to slow down this monetary policy phase, because we've seen that it's really monetary policy that will lead to inflation problems in the past. So the sacrifice ratio tells us the number of percentage points of 1 year's output loss in the process of reducing inflation by 1 percentage point. Canadian estimates of the sacrifice ratio range from 2 to 5. In other words, for each percentage point that inflation is reduced, between 2 and 5% of 1 year's output must be sacrificed during this transition. So therefore, GDP may fall by 2 to 5%. For a 1 percentage drop in inflation. That's big. That's really big. So that's why, like I said many times, that it's very, very important for the government to keep inflation on track. So sometimes when people say, menu cost, shoe leather cost, there's not much to it. I thought there was more cost to inflation. Well, yeah, there is more cost of letting inflation out of hand. So if you want to stimulate the economy really rapidly and you let it get out of hand and people embed those expectations, we had 2% for the last 15 years and we got 5% last year. New negotiations coming up, I'm going to ask for more than 2%. I think inflation is going to be higher again this year, so I don't want to get screwed over. And based on this process, you're going to lead to a sacrifice ratio or a certain problem. Okun's law says that the number of percentage points the unemployment rate increases when GDP falls by 1 percentage point. So here it's inflation to GDP, here's GDP to unemployment, essentially. On the other hand, there's some people that will say that rational expectation may lead to the possibility of costless disinflation. Costless in the sense of we don't have to sacrifice any GDP. We just have to tell them that we're going to reduce inflation levels and people will believe us. And therefore, based on this information, if we use this new information that they give us when forecasting the future and when embedding our wages, well, then it's going to be costless. People will say, well, it's been 2% or let's say 5% for many years, but the government says we want to drop to 2%. Or let's say in our case, our target's been 2% for many years, but now the government says we want to drop that to 1%. If we believe them, they're credible, and we take it for granted, we're like, fine. We believe what you're saying. You've made big announcements about it. We're just going to negotiate for 1% raises. On that note, it would be pretty costless to do so. But on the other hand, if you have people that are like, I'm not quite sure, or I'm a little greedy, I'm going to keep asking for 2% till I'm convinced that's 1%. In both of those cases, it's going to lead to a certain sacrifice ratio because people are asking for too much. So it all depends which of these two is dominant. In the 1980s, Bank of Canada was faced in the early 1980s with the prospect of reducing inflation. So we didn't know what was going on. When group claimed that reducing inflation was going to be very costly and thus the sacrifice ratio was going to be high, the rational expectation proponents predicted that reducing inflation would be much less costly. Let's see what happened. Well, so these are all the years before, but we're focusing on these last years here. So from 1980, they were trying to reduce inflation. We were at roughly 10% in those years. And you could see as soon as they managed to reduce inflation a little bit, there's this massive spike in unemployment going from like 7.5% to about 11%. Then, so this year here was big sacrifice for a small drop in inflation, massive increase in unemployment. The next year, bigger drop in inflation, smaller increase in unemployment. So people are starting to take it a little bit more seriously. Then we're actually able to drop inflation and increase employment. There might be other things that have come into play. And then stable, less unemployment, but stable inflation. And then it kind of jumps back up. As we're getting less unemployment, inflation kind of went back up. So there's a mixture of the two going on. It's not clear cut, but there's definitely some sacrifice going on. So the biggest thing in all of this is credibility of the central bank is key. Credibility of the central bank is key. And that is why, again and again, when we talked about hyperinflation problems in the past, we really want to make sure that the central bank has a clear target and they're credible and they are removed from day-to-day political influence. This way, we can have a credible central bank, and with a credible central bank, if they need to make inflation adjustments, it's going to be taken into account quickly, rational expectations, very low cost of doing so, and that's the biggest thing. Credibility is really key in this whole process. And even if it's credible, we have a pretty credible central bank, there may still be some costs involved. So we don't want to let things get out of hand, because as soon as you let it get out of hand for one period, people wonder, well, is he going to let it get out of hand once again? It's that kind of idea of, I've never cheated for all of these years. You cheat once. The person, you might say, well, look, I've done well all these years, but this person's not taking you as a credible person anymore. They're not trusting you anymore. So it's a very bad problem that happens. So they have to remain as trustworthy and as on target as much as possible for all the time.